take a plane to another plane, to another plane, to another plane, bumping Baka not nice while I'm trapping in the rain.
Hello and welcome to episode number 25, a bit of a milestone episode, a special number for me. So on this, I'm absolutely humbled to have my guest today as the 25th episode guest, David W. Mathisen, who's the author of several books, most recently Myths and Trauma. I heard him just a couple weeks ago on the Tinfoil Hat podcast. And actually what's funny is I found you on Instagram after that and shared one of your posts, and a good friend of mine, Deke, hit me up and he goes, "Hey, I know David. I've had him on my podcast twice." So small world. And that's kind of fitting because the stuff that you've researched and that you talk about kind of really shows how small this ginormous universe really is. It's very interesting. We're all really connected, and so it's fitting that we kind of had a degree of separation that I didn't even know about. So shout out to Deke and shout out to Sam Tripoli, helped me to discover Mr. David Mathisen. So starmythworld.com is where you can find the best collection of all of his content, and it's super interesting stuff. So rather than try to summarize it in short form, I'll just let you kind of introduce yourself a little bit.
Great. Well, thanks, Ezza. It's a pleasure to be here. Or Eric, what's the backstory on the name of your show?
Yeah, no, it's kind of funny. I make music as well. So Ezza's my stage name. So I kind of transitioned that into the podcast. So that's why I stuck with that. And the Trips Balls is kind of just, I wanted to get into kind of non-mainstream topics and sort of get out there. I wanted people to be able to talk about, psychedelic stuff, spiritual stuff, and religion and the Bible, and that kind of leads into the kind of stuff you get into, which is how the Bible and pretty much every myth comes from the stars. Which the second that I heard that, it resonated with me instantly. Just a slight bit of background on me is I went to a Catholic school, so I learned about Jesus and all that, but it was a very open and kind of progressive Catholic school where in our library there was a space section and a UFO section. And so right from a kid, I had both in my life. And I always felt like there had to be some connection there. There can't be a God and all of this amazing stuff in space and there be no connection between the two. That's kind of how I always felt. So yeah, your work really resonates with me. So now I'll really give you that chance to introduce yourself. My apologies.
Well, no, not at all. And congratulations on making it to 25 episodes. And that's
yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I think that podcasts are actually very important. I think that media is very important. I think that information is obviously extremely important, news and what's going on in the world around us. And so the story of how I came to the realization that all the world's myths are based on the stars is actually similar. It sounds like you have an interest in space, and you also have a background in studying the scriptures of the Bible. And I was actually a literalist, taking the Bible literally for a good almost 20 years of my adult life. And but I always loved the myths. I always loved the stars. And when I encountered a book called Hamlet's Mill, which was published in 1969, that talks about, I don't know if you've ever heard of Hamlet's Mill.
I haven't, no.
Yeah, it's a book that I actually have seen a lot of people refer to it. And what happened was my parents were going to see Machu Picchu, and I wanted to get my mom something that was related to Machu Picchu. And I found a book by Graham Hancock and his wife, Santha, that is called Heaven's Mirror.
Yes.
And it has a whole section on Machu Picchu, and it's beautifully illustrated with kind of glossy pages. It's like hardback, and the photographs by Santha are just amazing. She's an awesome artist and photographer. And so I got that book for my mother. And then I said, this this is really an interesting subject. I hadn't heard of Graham Hancock before that. So I started reading some of his other
Yeah,
work and watching
he's
his
awesome.
videos.
Yeah.
And he refers to Hamlet's Mill. And so I read Hamlet's Mill, and it's a very kind of a convoluted book. It's not really a straightforward book, but I had already been very knowledgeable about the myths. I grew up loving the myths, and I actually had an opportunity to teach at the college level the Odyssey, and I'd done some postgraduate work on some other mythical texts. And the idea that, and I'd always loved the stars. I'd grown up going out to look at the stars with my dad,
Mm-hmm.
and I grew up with the books of H.A. Ray on how to look at the stars, which I mentioned on the Sam Tripoli
Yes.
interview that you heard.
Yep.
And so I grew up with that system. And when I read in Hamlet's Mill, they're not completely tying it all together, but they're saying there's something out there. We don't have all the connecting pieces, but there seems to be this enormous worldwide system that's very ancient, that seems to pop up a little bit in one culture and another piece of it in another culture. They call it like a mist painting, where there's this technique in Chinese painting and Japanese painting where most of the painting is mist, but there's just a little piece. You just see a little part of the scene in one corner and maybe another little part of the scene in another corner. And they said, that's what we feel like we're seeing here on the earth. There's this system that
Huh.
ties it all together, but there's all this kind of mist in between. Well, that
Right.
just fascinated me. So I became
Yes.
kind of obsessed with that. And because I already love the myths and I already love the stars. And they said this system has to do with number, it has to do with the cycles of the heavens, and it has to do with myth, and it seems colors, all these different disciplines, weights and measures around the world seem to have been part of some kind of a system that's now lost. And they said this system is so ancient that the dust of centuries was already lying on top of it by the time the ancient Greeks wandered onto the scene. So
It's
that
not
just,
not comprehensible, right? Like
it's amazing.
yeah, and I love the ancient culture stuff because and what really blew my mind, growing up and sort of starting to learn about that there were ancient cultures, much less how much they knew and they were all over different parts of the world and kind of seemed to follow the same system, right? The super mind-blowing thing to me was not only the fact that it predated the Bible, but by how much it predates the Bible. And now we're finding that it may predate even more than we thought it did. So as a kid growing up in the Catholic school or growing up, sort of with the Bible as your main, this is the gospel, so to speak. You don't really think how much there is before that and how much there was before that. And, it kind of is a mind-blowing revelation when you realize that a lot of the stories in the Bible are kind of just renamed and reworked stories that were taught by ancient cultures far before.
Well, and they're based on the same system from start to finish. The stories in the Bible are based on the same celestial system that is underlying the stories of the Greek myths and the Norse myths and the myths of the Maya in the Americas and the myths of Australia and the cultures of the Pacific and of Africa and ancient India. And that is mind blowing. And I was not open to that at first. At first, because I was taking the Bible literally, I was open to a connection between the stars and the myths, but not the
Right.
stars and the Bible. So, and for people who are not looking for that, I'm not trying to force this information on them. You know,
Of
I,
course.
I, uh, I think that there is truth and beauty in all the myths of the world, and they're
Mhm.
all connected. And
Yes.
for people who want to take them literally, I've said, I'm not running around trying to change people's opinion if they're trying to take the Bible literally, as long as they're not using it to justify or falsely justify violation of other people's rights.
Absolutely.
Which, the problem is when you take the Bible literally, sometimes you also get this teaching that because this is literal and true, then therefore everybody else's myths are just myths and they're wrong, and we need to convert them to this one.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's
And that,
historically been a very big problem. So
absolutely.
I'm interested in, how you, how, how did you get to, because I'm not trying to convert people to this, uh, from it's for people who are looking for it. So if you're interested in it, I'm happy to talk about it.
Yes.
But I'm also, but I also, it's not the people generally at, the level of just going to work and believing what they want to believe, who are mainly, the problem is with the teachings when it gets into motion of, hey, we have to go over to the Maya civilization and crush it with soldiers. That's,
Right.
that's the problem, is originating at a much higher level of power and control, and that's where I believe the real problems are. So
Yeah. And just the fact that a lot of this information exists, but nobody's exposed to it, like, and nobody's taught it, nobody is taught alternate ways to interpret things. Again, I have to give credit to the Catholic school I went to, because most of my teachers did have the sort of the attitude that the Bible mostly wasn't to be taken literally, or that some of it was literal and some of it was myth, or that the New Testament was real but the Old Testament was myth. It's just like, all sorts of different. So I always kind of took it all with a grain of salt. But when you start to see the connections between those stories and some of the ones that are just washed away as myth, like I remember as a kid, they had the Disney movie Hercules, and there's Zeus and this, that, or the other, and you find out that all those stories have been around, for thousands of years, and it's like, well, wait a minute, so those gods aren't real, those are just myths, but our God is real, it's not a myth, and you know what I mean? So we're almost taught as though anybody who existed before Jesus was just sort of a Neanderthal, you know what I mean? Like they just believed in these silly myths, and you know what I mean? But now we're enlightened because of Jesus, and now we're smart and all that. And again, I'm on the same page as you. I don't discredit anybody's belief or think that anybody needs to be converted, as long as it gets them through the day and they're not harming anybody else, or as you say, going on crusades overseas to crush other civilizations. Then there's certainly nothing harmful about taking the Bible literally, and there's lots of good to be taken from it, I'm sure. But yeah, I agree with you. Where it becomes harmful is when people do infringe on other people and start to look at, we believe this, so we're better than those people who believe that. And also, what just kills me as somebody who has developed an interest in this stuff later in life is how everything before the Bible is just kind of washed away, in the education system. It's all kind of, well, they believed in rain gods and earth gods. And it's like, now I'm growing up and I'm like, hold on a sec. A lot of that makes a lot more sense to me, and then you sort of stumble on somebody like yourself who's sort of connecting the dots on all of these things, and then connecting it to, the heavens above us, which I think naturally we all have an inclination to look up there for our biggest questions and the biggest answers, right? So I think that there's no coincidence that all throughout humanity that has been a constant up there. There's been one common denominator, and it's been, we've all looked up there and thought, wow, what is going on, right? And there's plenty of conclusions to be drawn that you have in your research, that we've always looked to the stars, and as you say, as you said so awesomely on the Sam Tripoli podcast, is the Bible is about you, and these myths are about you. And that's what really resonates with me, is like, you can find there's a real personal connection to be found there when it clicks that, hold on, this isn't some historical figure from way back in the day that lives in a completely different world and has nothing to do with me. This is connected to the same universe that I'm living in. This is the same, these kind of archetypes and characters that we find in the constellations, they're within us, right? And we kind of live out the myths and the parables that can be found out there, in our day-to-day lives in kind of a microcosm way, you know. So I love that that connection can be drawn as well. And then, you know, I'm also really interested in how it connects to modern storytelling, both consciously and unconsciously. Some of these myths and stuff work their way into modern storytelling, I think, just because it's so ingrained in us now, you know. So I find a lot of that stuff super interesting.
Yeah, well, thanks. I'm glad that resonated with you about how the myths are about you. And I'm not saying that. I do think that by taking them literally, people do uh, tend to miss what they're saying because they're not speaking actually in a literal language. They're speaking in a metaphorical and esoteric
Right,
language.
right.
So I do believe that people are missing out, but I'm not trying to force the people who are not looking, who are totally satisfied. I'm not trying to go up to them and say, hey, get rid of what you believe and change to what I believe. I believe that's wrong to do that. But for people
Agreed.
who are saying, I feel like something is missing, or I've always felt
Right,
like something is missing, and
right.
then, I was not looking for this, but
Hmm.
the more I looked in the Bible and saw that the stories in the Bible are based on the stars, I had to wrestle with this myself and decide, okay, am I going to accept the evidence that I'm
Right.
seeing, or am I going to close that out and continue to take it literally? And eventually I had to change my whole paradigm. And that's a big deal, to change your whole lens through which you see the world. But
Yes.
I absolutely believe that, as there's a quotation I love by a writer named Alvin Boyd Kuhn, who lived from about, I think, 1885 to 1963. And he said, the ancient sacred stories in the Bible and the myths, they're 1,000 times more precious as myth than as alleged history. And he's the one who I first read, who says these stories are about you, and until every
Yes.
single reader sees himself or herself as the center of that story, you're not actually understanding what it's trying to say. So I'm not saying that you don't miss out. In fact, I think you mentioned my most recent book, Myth and Trauma.
Yes.
One of the central focuses of these, one thing I had to wrestle with was, well, if they're all based on the stars, then why? What is, what, wait a minute, I was
Right.
happily believing all this. So what's this about? And it's taken me a long time to wrestle with that question. They're talking about some profound things that we need, like you said, in this very moment. It
Yes.
has to do with like the biggest struggles that we're going through. This is the ancient myths are given, I'm convinced, to help us with the things that we need to recover who we are. And one of the biggest focuses that they have has to do with repairing trauma, recovering from trauma,
Right.
from separation from yourself.
I love it.
And
I
I
love
think
it.
that taking it as literal actually can tend to inflict trauma. There's a lot of things that have been taken literally
Wow.
that has to do with, actually, it shouldn't be taken literally, but when you take it literally, it turns out to inflict trauma.
It can
Like,
traumatize you.
it can
Yeah.
traumatize you. That's right. You're
Wow.
you're you're born in sin. You're going to hell unless you do this or have this change inside of you, or that is a
Wow.
traumatizing uh,
Yes.
interpretation. There's the woman must be subordinate to the man, which is based on texts that point back to the Adam and Eve story. Well, the Adam and Eve story can be shown to be based on the stars. So that whole narrative is a celestial narrative. It's telling us profound things, but it's not telling us literal things. So I would argue that one of their central focuses, and that's what in Myth and Trauma I explore that, is to help us to repair this loss of who we are. And
Wow.
we can really hear that more clearly when we understand the
Oh
language they're actually
man.
saying. So
Absolutely mind-blowing, and there's so much to unpack there. But yeah, you know, almost every story where, you know, going from the modern myths to modern story, I mean, sorry, from the ancient myths to modern storytelling, involves a separation and a coming back together, a separation and a coming back together. It's almost always the arc of the story, right? Like everything starts out okay, somewhere along the middle everything goes haywire, there's a separation, and then to the end you figure out how to bring it all back together using the tools that you learned from the time that you were separated or traumatized, right? So I feel like, yeah, the fact that we've kind of lost touch with that fundamental thread that's gone through all of the storytelling, that the story that we still tell and we still repeat, we don't even know, we've lost touch with what it really means and how it helps us deal with things. And especially, as you say, you take some of these stories literally, it would be like, imagine taking the Avengers literally. You'd be like, oh my God, Thanos is coming, and there's going to be an alien invasion. And it's like, well, that's not a real story, but there's plenty of lessons to be learned there for how, you separate from your loved ones, come back together. I feel like having lost touch with what these stories teach us is a big problem and as you say, we need that, and we've lost it as a society. And it might be perhaps not the sole root, but it might be a big part of a lot of what we go through as a species and why we can't seem to figure it out. And we're just constantly going through more trauma, it seems, because we can't seem to get to that point where we reach the resolution.
Yeah, no, you said a lot. I love how excited you got with that part about seeing that in all the stories. And it's interesting that you're a musician, or you're, a DJ.
Yeah.
And like you said, shout out to DJ DiCatello. I
Yes,
heard your
DiCatello.
I heard your interview with Deke, where you said that he's the reason, or one of the reasons you got into podcasting. So I think,
Absolutely, yeah.
yeah, I've been on his show twice, and when I saw that you were friends, I said, okay, well, and you're both in the Niagara area, it looks like.
Absolutely, yeah. St. Catharines, Ontario, so about 15 minutes from the falls.
Wow. Yeah, I've got a good buddy from Buffalo. So,
Oh, awesome. Very close, yeah.
yeah, so I know about beef on weck.
Wow, okay.
Nobody in California even knows what that is.
No, I wouldn't imagine. There's probably a lot going on in California we got no idea
Well,
about
yeah,
too. So.
well, that's top secret. Actually, we should edit that out. We don't want the secret to get out.
Yeah, I know, exactly. We don't want all those yuppies coming over.
But actually, what I was going to say is music does the same thing. There is disharmony, and then it resolves, right?
Yes.
You see that in every song, or there are resolutions. So that has to do, these myths have to do with our separation from ourself, which
Yes.
actually causes all the mainly all the problems that we face. Addiction is a form of not being able
Right.
to be with yourself. ADHD is these are things that some of the most cutting edge healers are talking about. By no means everybody in the medical profession is talking about this, but you've probably heard me mention Dr. Gabor-Mate. And so
Yes.
people who have not, encountered my work before,
East Vancouver.
oh, really? Yeah, that's
Shouts
right.
out to, yeah,
Yeah,
you
that's right.
mentioned that. Shouts out to East Van. I got some friends in East Van, and actually when you mentioned that he worked there and did his addictions work there, I knew it was for real, because I've been
Yeah.
out there, man, and it's, there's real problems out there, and the fact that a gentleman like that, what an angel, to be there.
Well,
But
and so what I was going to say is, stop what you're doing, take out whatever your podcast searching app is that you use, and search for his interviews and listen to them. And there are a few other healers who are talking about the same healing of trauma. It's becoming more understood, but it's still very cutting edge. Dr. Gabor Mate, Dr. Peter Levine, Dr. Lawrence Heller. So these are people you can search for if you're interested in this subject. But what really astonished me when I heard the things that they were saying was, this is what the myths are talking about. And I'd been talking about, in my analysis of the myths, there's so many twins patterns. There's all these patterns of twins
yes.
throughout the myths. We can talk about the twins of Gemini, Castor and Pollux in the Greek myths, but there's others. Achilles is actually in the Iliad, Achilles and Patroclus they're almost like a twinned pair. There's Heracles actually has a twin brother, Iphicles, and Heracles is the son of a divine father and a mortal woman, and Iphicles is his twin, but he has a mortal father and a mortal mother. So this pattern of a mortal twin and a semi-divine or a divine twin, we see this in myths around the world, and it has to do with actually not two different people, but it's actually our own separation from ourself. We actually have an essential self, an essence that we can operate from self. This is what Dr. Richard Schwartz is another one. He pioneered the system of therapy, which is today called IFS, Internal Family Systems. And he talks about how he was a family counselor, and he started to understand all the dynamics of a family and how a family operates as a system. And I actually have a little bit of a background in systems engineering. I minored in systems engineering, and systems in a family, he's trying to heal issues that have to do with the family system. But then he said, I started to realize that these systems are actually going on inside of people. Like we have a critic who's criticizing, or we have a protector who's trying to protect the vulnerable self that got hurt. And
Yes.
so
Yes.
he pioneered this whole system that's called Internal Family Systems, IFS. So he's another healer, cutting edge healer, who is working with trauma and how we get cut off from our own self. Okay, and he expresses it in terms of
Wow.
these systems. So that is what, when I heard these cutting edge, fairly recent, in the past several decades is when they've been developing this. Actually, since the Vietnam War, I think Dr. Larry Heller talks about, well, they had to deal with all this post-traumatic stress that they were encountering after the Vietnam War, and trying to figure out, that's when trauma really started to become
a thing.
studied more,
Yeah.
or understood more.
Right. It was always a thing, but like trauma as a concept, right?
Right. And so what's amazing is the most ancient myths are talking about this. In the Gilgamesh epic, which is one of the most ancient texts that we have, literally the 3rd millennium BC, there is a twinned pair between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the twins, but they look almost identical. And people, when they see Enkidu walking down the street, they say, oh, he looks just like Gilgamesh, except Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine. And it's the same pattern that I was just mentioning about Heracles and Iphicles, or Castor and Pollux. One is divine, one is mortal. It is actually not talking about two different people. It's talking about you, and how you have become separated from yourself. And Dr. Schwartz talks about, it's amazing. Everybody has this essential self.
Yes.
It's already there. He talks about how he was so amazed because he learned in all his psychology training that for us to have true self, this confident self that we can act from, you had to have a good, nurturing upbringing environment. And he said, what astonished me was, I discovered that it's actually in everybody. This self is actually in everybody, but we suppress it, or it gets in an unhealthy situation where we're not given the right nurturing environment to grow as a child. We get separated off from ourself, but that self is always there, and you can always reconnect with it. And that's what the ancient myths are talking about.
Like, man, I this is crazy, because this is stuff that, like, when you first mentioned, these incredible doctors and researchers and thinkers who are on the cutting edge of this sort of figuring out trauma and figuring out things like PTSD, starting with Vietnam, and then looking into how that really affects people, and as you say, just very recent stuff from the last few decades, and the conclusion that they're reaching is that it stems from a separation from the self. My first thought was, science is discovering what the ancients talked about, right? Because I've been reading about, I've always had an interest in like ayahuasca and stuff like that, which is part of the reason for the Ezza Trips Balls title of the show. So I read about a lot of that old stuff, and I always thought, like, like, I wish I could explain to some of my more like matter of fact, only believe what you can see, hard-headed, science-y friends some of this kind of more woo-woo trippy stuff that I read about that really resonates with me, and that I feel like there's a real truth to, and that it's pointing to something that is, yeah, a deeper self, essentially, right, behind this ego, and the whole concept of the ego self and the true essence of self. I've been reading about stuff like that for since I was about 18. I'm about to turn 30 tomorrow, by the way.
Hey,
So
congratulations.
thank you so much. So this stuff I've been
Happy
reading
birthday
about,
tomorrow.
yeah, thank you so much. So I've been reading about this kind of stuff for years, but like never saw where I could show more like sciencey minded people, like, here's the scientific evidence for some of this stuff. And then you're telling me about some of these amazing researchers who have been working on that and have been finding that, and more importantly to me, not being a scientist, is finding the language to express it in a way that our modern world can understand and say, yes, that's evidence of the essential self.
Well, that's what I mean. It's so exciting to me because the myths, I believe, can help. That, I mean, we have this tremendous inheritance in the myths that
Right.
to every single culture was given these powerful myths that are, as I said, there's a writer, a scholar named Peter Kingsley, who calls them the original instructions that were given to every single culture, that they treasured, that they passed down from one generation to another, the original instructions. And
Right.
when you talk about shamanic healing, what's really interesting is that the IFS, um, I listened to a very interesting interview with Dr. Schwartz, and the interviewer asked, it almost seems like what you're doing is similar to what a shamanic culture will do,
Right.
where you're going in and talking to, let's say, the protector. There's a protector part of the personality that's developed, or that person's inner mind that has developed in
Yes.
order to protect something. It's a defense mechanism,
Right.
in order to protect against some kind of trauma that has occurred, some kind of harm that has happened. And we can get into that a little bit, but what he does is he talks to the protector and says, well, why are you playing this role? And what are, or he has the person who's trying to resolve these issues talk to, what are you protecting me from? What are you doing? And to honor the service of that protector and say, hey, thank you for doing that, but I don't need it anymore.
Wow.
It's like the things that are happening when you suddenly fly into a rage. You're driving down the street and someone cuts you off, and you find yourself screaming.
You're a
It,
different person,
it's like,
right?
whoa, who took over? It's like
That's the
and
that twin, right?
well, yeah, what happened? What am I so threatened with? Is it that I'm not going to, get to the restaurant before they close, and I'm afraid that I'm going to go hungry or something? I mean, it's usually an irrational fear, but there's probably something deep inside that triggered that. That over the top reaction
Yes.
was triggered by some kind of actual occurrence in your childhood where you were. And some people may say, oh, this sounds so ridiculous. This sounds so, come on, don't tell me that everything that I do today is because of what happened in childhood. But actually the myths talk about that reaction too. They have the
Oh, wow. Yeah. Doubting
doubting Thomas.
Thomas.
There are passages in certain texts where it says, many people are even ignorant of even the existence of the higher self. There's actually a passage in a book called the Book of Thomas, which did not make it into the Bible. It's one of the Gnostic texts that was discovered in the 1940s in Egypt. But Jesus is talking to Thomas and says, many don't even know the existence of the higher twin, the higher self. but it's not good for you to be ignorant of it. So I'm going to tell you about it. See, we don't even let ourselves know that this has happened. Why? Because it happened as a defense mechanism. And not to lean, I'm not a psychologist, so go listen to the professionals in this field.
Absolutely.
But what Dr. Mate will say is, let's say you grew up in a household, you weren't abused, you weren't physically abused or sexually abused. You can still have trauma. Let's say your dad was always yelling at your mom or always beating your mom or something.
Mm-hmm.
As a child, let's say 2 years old or 3 years old, which is more threatening to you? The idea that your father is actually bad and dangerous and could destroy you if he turns against you, or the idea that you're bad and that if you just do better, you can fix it. See, it's actually more comforting to the child to believe, well, my dad's good, my mom's good, they're not out of control, the world's not out of control.
Right.
You're dependent on your parents.
Right.
You must attach to them. You're programmed to attach to them.
Yes.
But when they act in a way that is threatening, instead of saying, oh, maybe there's something wrong with them, I better not attach to them, what you actually say is, maybe there's something wrong with me. And you disconnect from certain parts of yourself.
Right.
And you suppress them. And you say, because it's less threatening to say, oh, maybe I'm doing something wrong, but I can get better. I can fix myself. And then you spend the rest of your life trying to do that. You don't even realize you're doing it. But what's happened is you've started to separate from certain parts of yourself.
Absolutely.
Unconsciously as a defense mechanism. So when I heard these sorts of things, I said, this is what is going on in the myth. But this is one of the things that's going on in the myth. I mean, we can talk about some specific examples if you want. I've got a little slideshow, but
yeah, absolutely. I would love to see some, because I think that, I mean, this is all incredible stuff, and it's mind blowing. And, these traumas, have been passed on generation to generation as well, right? Because that parent, not knowing that they've been separated from themselves, acts in a way that causes the child to that. Right. So
what
we've
are they
got
acting out on, right? They're probably threatened about something, or there's
exactly
there's a role in their head that is taken over. They're not acting out of self. And which would you rather act out of, your essential self or your doubting self? It's I've used the metaphor of Golem, how Golem is split because of trauma.
Yes.
Right. He's got this split, and he's got this protecting it's Smeagol and Golem, right? But the Golem character actually thinks he's protecting. He's like, I'm the one who got us through this. I'm the one who I'm protecting us. Where would you be without me? Right.
Wow.
So but which would you rather have steering your life? Your essence, who you really are, or this
defense mechanism?
It's almost like an algorithm. Yeah, it's like this program that got written when you were 2 or 3 years old, and it's like, would you really want your computer running with a program that was written back in the 70s or 80s? It's an obsolete program, or it was written for a situation. It kicked in to try and help you, but actually it's in many ways can hold us back. And that's what the myths are talking about with these stories of the twin. There's always this twin who's doubting, who's so full of doubt, he's almost unable to function. And we self-doubt
constantly, right?
So
that to me is also why we need the myths, and that, it's, to me, what you're doing is so important, even though, as you say, you're not trying to convert anybody or whatever, but I just feel like, because these things are so like unconsciously passed down generation to generation, and nobody, like you said, as Jesus said to Thomas, most people don't even know about the existence of the essential self. We're almost fighting a losing battle unless we look to the help that we've been passed down, from these myths. And the most mind-blowing thing, and this is going to lead into the slideshow, is that these things all come from the stars. So we're we have everything we need to get through this stuff up there, and in the myths that correspond to it that have also been passed on to us. So it's almost as if the entire universe is designed so that we awaken to the truth of the essential self, but yet we're always just evading it somehow, and it's through all this trauma and all this like passed on, so on and so forth. So I want to get into the stars now and some of these specific examples that you've brought, that could really connect that part of it to people's minds, because I think that the idea that, okay, yeah, the myths are kind of metaphors that I can apply to my own life, I think people can get with that. But where it really gets mind-blowing is that there's plenty of evidence that all of this comes from the stars.
Yeah, they're all based on the stars. And it's also important to know, I think you brought up in either what you just said, but also one of the things you said a few minutes ago, we actually do live in a trauma-inducing society.
Yes.
It is in many ways a dysfunctional society. And
yes,
I would argue that's because we have lost touch with those original instructions,
right.
because they were stamped out by this teaching that, no, you have to take them literally. They're not
My goodness.
metaphorical.
So yeah, at some point that stamp out happened, and then that's where parents lose touch with that, and then they pass it on to their kids, and then they have no concept of it, and they pass it on to their kids, and but imagine how drastic that stamping out must have been to have reached to where we are now, right?
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right that the myths are this resource that were given to humanity, and then somehow somebody said, no, I don't want that to be known by, I don't want that to benefit everybody. I want that to just benefit me. And
Wow.
we'll keep it to ourselves and stamp it out for everybody else. And
it worked.
That's been going on. Now,
it's so sad that it worked.
Yeah. Yeah. So were you, did you ask me about the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood?
Yes, that was me. Absolutely.
I thought that was you.
I had to bite my tongue when you brought up the different twins examples, because I wanted to say Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth.
Very
right?
perceptive.
But we don't have
absolutely right.
No, we don't have to go there yet.
You said you wanted to kind of do something different, and I've never talked about that. So that's where I started the slideshow. If you wanted to.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. So let me do a share screen. And when I do this, let's see. You got to enable the screen sharing.
Okay, let me see here. Multiple participants, advanced sharing options, all participants. Sweet. All right, I think you should be good.
Great. Okay, so let me share the screen. But we don't have to talk about that if you don't want to. Right?
No, I definitely do.
I guess you read my my blog post about it, I think is.
Yeah, no, I was actually really excited to talk about it because I love that movie. It's funny, I went on a vacation recently and I watched it on the plane ride there, and it was my third time seeing it. And then on the plane ride back, I was like, you know what, I'm gonna watch it again. So I've seen it like 4 or 5 times now. And so after I spoke to you about potentially doing a podcast, you made that blog post. So that's why I was like, oh yeah, we got to talk about that, because the 1-year anniversary was just a few days ago. And to me, it's nothing better has come out since, man. It's my favorite movie right now. And I love it. So the fact that you were able to, and as I said at the beginning, like I've always been really interested in how some of the modern stuff fits into some of these. And interestingly enough, you had another post later, I think it was yesterday, about how some of the rituals work into the modern pop culture and stuff, which has always interested me. So yeah, I saw you do this post about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and I'm like a huge Tarantino fan, so I loved it. So yeah, get into some of that, and I'm sure my listeners would love it as well.
Yeah, well, see, I wasn't really a big Tarantino fan. In fact, I was like an anti-Tarantino fan. I really disliked his. I mean, I remember when he first came on the scene. I'm a little bit older than you. I'm not just about to turn 30. But I was really turned off by how just he was really took violence to a new level in his films, right? And Once Upon a Time in Hollywood has got a lot of violence in it.
No exception.
Not as much as his earlier stuff, but I really believe he is doing some extremely profound things. If you look at his film work as it should be looked at, like literature, which it is, and I taught literature at the military academy at the college level. I went to the military academy at West Point, so not far from you there, but in New
Nice.
York, and I taught literature there, and this film, just like his other films, I believe is doing something very important. It's got a very important message, and that's what I wrote about in that blog post. I wrote, so this came out on July 26th, 2019.
Yes.
Well, that date is significant. Okay.
Wow.
We'll talk about that. Someone like Tarantino, who's at the top of his game, who is a master. I mean, there's no doubt that he is a master filmmaker. You don't get to his level without being some kind of special level of talent, right?
Absolutely.
So it's not an accident what day he decides to release this movie. But so I watched it on the anniversary. I hadn't seen it since, I didn't see it right when it first came out. I think I saw it in December, but I saw it again on July 26th. So then on July 27th, I wrote that blog post about some meditations on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that you mentioned. But it's actually about murders that took place on August 8th and 9th in Hollywood, right? The Tate LaBianca murders, real murders that shocked the world. And so he's saying once upon a time in Hollywood, and then he goes on to show this movie, and probably the most shocking thing about the movie is what?
The twist.
He changes. So he depicts actually completely false, outcome.
Yes.
The murders don't happen. The murderers end up
getting murdered,
killed instead. So what's going on? Well, he's telling you right there in the title of the movie. When you start a story with "Once Upon a Time," what are we saying to people?
It's a fairy tale.
We're going to tell them. We're going to tell you a fairy tale. Did I unshare?
Yeah, I lost your share there.
That's okay. Yeah, he's talking about. I'll go back to it in a second. It's hard for me to see the mouse when I'm sharing.
No worries.
He's telling you, I'm going to tell you a fairy tale, and it's going to depict some completely false events, and I'm going to do that for a reason. Now, I don't know what his reason is. I'm analyzing it, okay, as a third party.
Of
course.
I'm
not an expert. I'm not an expert on the Manson killings, okay, but there are experts that you can go consult. And I believe that what he's doing when he says, I'm going to show you a total fairy tale, is saying, you've been told a fairy tale. See, what you believe about reality is a fairy tale, has been in the power of places like Hollywood and the media to get you to believe things that aren't real is enormous. And he's playing with that. He's showing you that in the movie, right? He's showing you, it's unreal, but it can really influence people. Even the killer Tex Watson is saying, "What? That was Rick Dalton? I had that guy's lunchbox when I was a kid. County law. That was my favorite lunchbox."
Oh,
See?
man.
It is extraordinarily powerful, right? And he's saying, I'm going to show you a fairy tale because everything you've been told about this murder is actually, you've been told a fairy tale. And he's playing with that. And it sounds like you read the blog post because
I did, yes.
because you asked me to talk about it. But
yeah,
I talk. So let's go back to the slideshow real quick.
Yeah, there's some very specific hints in there that you mentioned in the blog post.
Right. So where's my go back to sharing the screen. Right. Sorry about this.
No problem.
Do that and that. Okay. So
Perfect.
I think that what he's doing here is showing you that you need to re-look at this, at the ending. You know, if I'm subverting the ending, this was actually a very horrific um, incident in history that needs to be understood better. And he just put it in everybody's consciousness. I mean, now there's nobody who doesn't know who Sharon Tate is after watching this movie. I mean, you know, Margot Robbie does this unforgettable performance of Sharon Tate. And Sharon Tate was this beautiful actress who was involved in a lot of actually very occult type movies, and was married to Roman Polanski. And so he's depicting completely false events to show you that you believe some fairy tales about history. And he does that actually in Inglourious Bastards too, right?
Absolutely.
Is that the way World War II ended?
Yeah, completely
No,
fictional version.
he totally, so he's saying, look, I think what he's saying is you better take another look at what you've been told happened, because what you've been told happened can be manipulated.
Yeah, and look how easy it was for me, one filmmaker, to repackage the whole story and make it very, very powerful and very, very convincing. Now imagine an entire media machine and an entire government-connected media machine making you believe whatever about
Right.
about an event.
So this event, you know, of the Tate LaBianca murders, and there was 7 people who were murdered. There was 5 people in the Sharon Tate residence. Roman Polanski wasn't there that night, but there was 5 people, and then 2 more people. The LaBianca husband and wife were killed the next night, and it's horrific. It was a horrific murder, and it happened in August of 1969, so 51 years ago this week, right? And so in my blog post, I refer back to Mae Brussel, and so that's okay. If you need
Sorry.
you need to talk to your kid. Talk to your kid. You don't want to. You got to.
I'm doing
connect.
a podcast, buddy.
It's all right. We can take some time out.
No, it's no big deal.
Okay.
He knows what's going on.
Okay. Yeah. So Mae Brussel wrote this. Actually, so I linked to. You can listen to this broadcast. Mae Brussel was doing what today we think of as podcasts. Way before there were podcasts, she was basically a housewife. She was raising her kids. She described herself as a housewife, and she was totally shocked by the murder of John F. Kennedy, and she was quite disturbed by some of the aspects of it that she saw, and she started to look into it. She ordered the whole Warren Commission report and read through it, and she had a mind that could make connections. And so in 1971, I linked to this broadcast that she did in October of 1971, talking about the Tate LaBianca murders and the other murders connected with the Manson family. And she talks about some just amazing things that you do not hear about. For instance, the fact that, first of all, Manson never actually killed anybody in those particular murders. He may have killed some people or tried to kill some people in different, but he was not the one who actually killed Sharon Tate and the others that night, as they show in that movie. But she talks about how, look, this looked like to me, and this she's talking about this in 1971. The Vietnam War is still going on. She said, this looked to me like a military raid. They shimmied up the telephone poles and cut the telephone lines. There was a dog that, there were dogs on the premises that didn't bark. They didn't make any noises, but they weren't killed. The dogs weren't killed. So how did that happen? There was a caretaker in like the back house who didn't even wake up. Okay. And these murders were very ritualistic. There was a lot of, the killers had spent a lot of time in the house making, gory messages on the walls with blood. And so what she's saying is, look, this doesn't add up to have been done by a bunch of screwball hippies.
Drugged out crystal meth.
Right, that you see in the movie. Like, look at the people that when Cliff Booth goes out to the ranch and that guy puts the knife in his tire,
Yeah.
right?
It's like as if these people are
Those
doing this.
guys, they're portrayed as complete screw ups, right?
Yeah.
And yet this was a very uh, horrendous but military style raid, where actually Mae Brussel doesn't talk about it in um, this particular broadcast, but she says it's possible that those dogs were incapacitated with shellfish toxin, where they were knocked out and then they came to later, but they weren't killed, and so they didn't bark. I mean, this was like
Wow.
this was operators who did this. This wasn't the hippies who did this. And so she's arguing that this was, and there are other people who have looked into this whole, matrix of not just the killings, but what happened afterwards, that cast some tremendous doubt on the story as it has been portrayed to us over the years. And so, I've seen like researchers who are into revealing what was going on in those murders get angry with the Tarantino film and say, this is the worst film ever because it shows, a total fantasy. This is not what happened. But I think that's actually what Tarantino's message is when he says,
Of
once
course.
upon a time in Hollywood. He's saying, look, you've been sold a fairy tale. And in fact, in that movie, we see the dog
I was gonna
noticing
say,
murders, right?
interesting about the dog, right?
So did he listen to, I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't research all the different researchers on this before he does a movie. And
Oh, for sure.
he puts that into the movie. But
And
what
that
else? Go
sorry, I was
ahead.
just gonna say that Mae Brussel broadcast, I did listen to a bit of that, and she is just awesome, man. Like, I can't believe that somebody like that was allowed to just, you know what I mean? She was just so matter of fact about the whole thing, and just like, yeah, so the actual killer Tex, there's a hung jury on him. He was in there, stabbing people 40 times and writing in blood on the walls, but they can't decide if he's guilty or not. But
That's
they've
right.
got, she's
Yeah,
just
no,
like so,
she's very hard hitting, and she talks about
oh
how
yeah.
does this guy with no criminal record, have this very high powered Beverly Hills lawyer who's met with him 30 or 40 times before the murders ever took place? What's going on with that? Or how did Manson get released from prison? Or he was released in 1967. So she goes into her theories about that, and you can order all her. She was on the air from like 1971 all the way until her untimely death in 1988, and you can listen to her weekly shows. You can get the set of discs and listen to them, and that's the history of the era that I was growing up in.
Wow.
And so I listen to them, now as an adult, about the things that were happening when I was growing up, because I remember people talking about them, but it was like, I don't know what people are talking. It's like they're talking about the Patty Hearst kidnapping. Well, she's talking about it. I remember the adults all talking about that kidnapping when I
Right.
was, just a little
Right.
kid, and now I'm able to listen to it. That's listening to her analysis of the events week by week. She's actually giving you basically a blow by blow as it's going on, and she's analyzing it as these things are taking place throughout the 70s and the 80s. So you can buy her discs for, I think, $60, get her complete archives. But there's been other researchers as well. So I'm not the expert on that, but what I was writing about in that blog is that Tarantino is saying something to people, and he's saying, wake up and don't live in a fantasy. I think that's one of the messages that's coming through.
Absolutely. And it's like, he's showing you just how simply, if that story is the real story and it was just a bunch of drugged up, like, as you say, screwballs going up to the Hollywood Hills to do this home invasion and murder. You're talking about rich people. They got security. So they got, you know what I mean? It's like the amount of things that could have possibly gone wrong. And that's kind of what he's shining light on, right? Is like, they just screw up and go to the wrong house and look what could happen, right? So it's like the idea that they just did this flawlessly. And then, me as somebody who was, born way after the fact, I find it interesting. The story that gets passed down is like, yeah, I've heard of Charles Manson. I know that he was basically what I know of Charles Manson before kind of when I found out, being a Tarantino fan, when I found out he was going to do a movie that was kind of centered around the Manson murders, I watched a couple documentaries on them and stuff like that, right? So that's when I kind of learned that there was more to the story than just he's just some crazy hippie that, you know, was a failed actor. And like, that's all we ever heard was he, you know, he tried to have a career in Hollywood, he failed, so he went nuts and moved out into the middle of nowhere and had a commune, and then a bunch of them came out and killed a bunch of actors because he was jealous. And you hear he's a hippie and all this, and it's like you start to listen to him talk. And again, I'm not saying that he's a saint, but it's like you listen to him defend himself, and it's like, yeah, he actually didn't kill anybody. Like when I first heard that Charles Manson was not involved in the Manson murders, it's like, wait a minute, what? Like, you know, so then I actually see the Tarantino movie, and at first I was expecting him to sort of have these like wake the fuck up kind of earth shattering, like kind of reveal how it's all bullshit, right? But he wasn't, he's so subtle, right? So I was almost disappointed at first that he didn't take like a swinging blow at the official narrative. He kind of just said, hey, maybe you should be questioning this, you know? But now after subsequent views, and as you said right at the beginning of your blog post, is his movies do need to be viewed more than once to really to get what he's trying to do. After subsequent views, I saw that, yeah, he is poking giant holes in the official narrative. He's just doing it in more subtle ways, right? He's showing you how, listen, you've been passed on this glamorized story of what happened, but if you really think about it and really do the research, like, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, no, I'm not defending Manson at all. He was a horrific, he was a criminal. He was a
Yes,
racist. He probably did murder some people, or he tried to.
of course.
And he was a very vehement racist. Okay. And if you read, there's a book by Tom O'Neill that just came out last year in 2019. It's called Chaos. And it's about this whole story. It shows that he was almost certainly working for or being used by, there was someone pulling his strings. Okay. So Mae Brussel talks about in this, that you obviously listen to it. She says, look, how does this guy get out of jail and have a full-size bus that's all decked out, you know, and how's he traveling all the way up to, you know, Washington and all the way down to Mexico on this bus with all these different young girls, actually many of them underage girls? That should trigger some like mental triggers in people's minds about
Red
stuff that's in the
flags.
news right now, right? We got stuff in the news right now about
Yeah.
law enforcement looking the other way on the exploitation of young girls
Yes.
in the whole Epstein uh, matrix of stuff, right?
Yep.
So he was traveling around with up to 50 followers at one point. Okay. Now, he didn't have a job. He was a ex-felon, or he was a felon on parole.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And how's he buying gas for the bus? How are all these 50 people eating food? You know, they show him going through the dumpsters in the movie to get food, which they did sometimes. But Mae Brussel says that was basically as punishment. You know, if they weren't sleeping with Charlie or one of the people that he wanted them to sleep with, they would have to go dumpster diving. But that's not how they ate every single day. They were, you know, this was going on for 2 years. He was released on March 21st, 1967. That's actually an equinox date. Okay. He was released in 67. These murders occurred in 69. He's driving around in a bus. He's living out on the Spawn Ranch. They had machine guns, automatic weapons that they're firing off, driving around in dune buggies. All these things cost money, right?
Yeah.
Ammo for automatic weapons is not free.
Mm-hmm. And he wasn't some big time criminal, right? He wasn't some big time criminal. He was like he was in and out of jail for all sorts of small stuff prior to that, wasn't he? Like he wasn't some connected mafioso guy who would have.
Yeah, it's a very sad story of his whole life. And actually, Peter Levenda talks about a lot of aspects of that in his book, Sinister Forces, Volume 1, but which also ties into some of the aspects of this story with Operation Bluebird and some of these horrific operations that were going on in the 60s and 70s that he might have been subjected to. But
I heard of one called Midnight Climax.
yeah, there was one that was in the Bay Area where I grew up, San Francisco.
A lot
Bay
of
Area.
weird like stuff with drugs and trying to co-opt the hippie movement.
Right. So if you read the book Chaos by Tom O'Neill, he gets into that. So I'm not an expert on this, is not my area of expertise,
Yeah,
but there have
no.
been researchers who have uncovered this.
Yes.
And the Manson family. So it's pretty clear that there were drugs, involved with the Manson family at the Spahn Ranch. But I don't think anybody has argued that it was such a big drug operation that they were hauling in this much money to have this much.
Yeah.
They have this much military equipment, and yet they're running around. And Mae Russell in 1971 is pointing this out and saying, how are they having military telephones and radio equipment, and they've got high-powered telescopes? They were running like military security around the Spahn Ranch with high-powered telescopes and things like that.
That's wild.
You and I aren't just running around buying high-powered telescopes and machine guns and dune buggies, unless we've got lots of money to burn. So who was supplying him with money is what she's asking. And this was so what she's saying is this was an operation. In other words, this wasn't just some outcast from society, but this was actually society itself, or some aspect of society. You see, you've been told a fairy tale, but this is actually a very dark story. It's a very, very ugly story that if you pull on this thread, it goes all the way up to, you can see that this wasn't just a drug hit or something like that, because the defense attorney for Susan Atkins, that was one of the young girls who did the murder, or young women who did the murder. I think she's actually the one who ends up being torched in the pool in Tarantino. That was the Susan Atkins character. But in real life, she had her defense attorney replaced by, Tom O'Neill uncovers this in his just blockbuster book, Chaos. Her defense attorney was replaced by someone who was working with the prosecution.
Ha.
And Manson's parole file was not given to his defense. His defense lawyer, when it came down to the sentencing, because this is a death penalty offense. In California, they still had the death penalty at the time.
Right.
He was asking for the parole record so that we could see why was he paroled, and that parole record was denied to the defense attorney, who was trying to argue for what, his client, why his client shouldn't get the death penalty. And he wanted to get all the information that he could, and he was not allowed to get the parole record. And that is very unusual in a death penalty. The defense is, the defense lawyer is supposed to be trying to defend his or her client, and is supposed to be able to get all the information that could possibly maybe have some mitigating information to help them not end up going to the gas chamber. In this case, in California, they still had the gas chamber at the time. That was denied, and it was actually denied by the United States Attorney General. That means the highest law enforcement officer in the whole United States. So something is going on with this case. And I leave it to the experts. I leave it to the experts of this, but people can look into it. But the point, to get back, I'm more comfortable analyzing literature and analyzing myths. So now let's go back to the Tarantino movie and talk about. See, in the let me go back to we'll just because I talked about this a little bit in the blog post. Let me go back to share screen. I'm not sharing screen right now, am I?
Nope.
Okay, yeah. So we'll go back to the slideshow here. And maybe you're seeing it again.
Yep.
So then she talks about, we've already talked about some of this analysis that she does, where she says, look, this was a military type operation. She says an ambush. I would say it would be technically it'd be a raid, but I just took a screenshot from YouTube. I'm not going to put anything in here that would get your video
cool.
deplatformed or
They're
whatever.
pretty strict these days. Yeah.
This is just right off of a YouTube page. So they've obviously allowed this as a video.
Yeah.
So this is just a screenshot, but this is the scene where Sam Wanamaker, who's an actual real person, who was a real director, says to Rick Dalton, what does he say? Hey, I want you to have we're going to do something different, right? We're going to give you a big droopy mustache.
Yeah.
We're going to make you kind of a
hippie
cowboy. We want you to have long hair, and we're going to get you a hippie looking jacket. And the the production managers, you can see there behind, he says, hey, she goes, oh, I've got the perfect thing. I've got a custard jacket. It's got tassels on the sleeves. That'll be perfect. I'll dye it dark chocolate brown so it won't look like it's from a Western. We'll bring it up to date. You could wear that tonight to the hippest restaurant on the Sunset Strip or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It's right there in the movie.
Yeah.
Well, that jacket is not associated with Rick Dalton, is it? That jacket's associated with Charles Manson. That is Manson's jacket that they're describing, but you never see Manson wearing it in the movie, do you?
No. And I always thought that line that she says kind of stands out. And when I read your blog post, I was like, aha. I'm like, I knew that line must have meant something, because it was just so like, it didn't need to be there in a way, and
It's really clear. Yeah, it's really clear. He says it like 2 or 3 times in this scene. We want to make you kind of a hippie.
Yeah, and kind of like a Hell's Angel looking hippie,
right. And she tells him, okay, I got the perfect jacket for you. And when I watched it the first time, I was like, where is this going? Because that's Manson's jacket. I'm like, was Manson going to steal the jacket off of Rick Dalton later? And that's going to become Manson's jacket? But you never see Manson wearing it.
Never gets brought up again.
Manson wears a leather jacket the one or two times that you see him.
Yeah.
You also see Rick Dalton wearing a leather jacket. So what does it mean that we see Rick Dalton wearing Manson's jacket, dressing as a hippie, playing a role as a hippie? What did Mae Brussel say about Manson? He was not a hippie.
Yep. And he hates hippies. Rick Dalton also hated hippies. Yeah.
He didn't like being called a hippie. There's plenty of people who lived during that time who afterwards attested to the fact that he never wanted to be called a hippie. So what is Tarantino doing? He's saying this Dalton character is playing a role as a hippie, doesn't really like hippies. We see that pretty clearly in the movie, right? But that's actually fits the real information about Manson. Was portrayed as a hippie, was told to play a role as a hippie, never liked hippies, hated hippies, didn't like being called a hippie, but he had to play that role. And so we have this very violent society, right? I mean, Rick Dalton is bounty law, right?
Yes.
And at the beginning of bounty law, what do they say? The guy goes, whether you're dead or alive, you're just a $sign to Jake Cahill on bounty law.
Yes.
And that's actually another Tarantino theme that he plays with again and again, right?
Absolutely. Bounties
on
heads.
In Glorious Bastards. And what does that mean? If dead or alive, you're just a what? A $sign.
Money, yep.
You're nothing but a commodity. You're just a $sign. So I think he's saying actually something about society that reduces people to basically a commodity.
Yeah,
it's
wild.
A violent, dysfunctional society. And actually, we see that Rick Dalton is kind of this, he's a likable character, but he's kind of losing it. He's coming apart, right?
Yep.
So I think that's what he's saying is this killing wasn't done by a bunch of hippies who were protesting against the system. They want you to think that.
Mm-hmm.
They want you to think that was a role, just like what Mae Brussel said. You've got to realize that your reality has been scripted by people who are very skilled at how to do this. And they're giving you a script, and they're playing like a stage, and they want you to think this was done by a bunch of, dirty hippies. And this is when the American public really turned against the hippies. Hippies were not running around killing people until this happened. Okay. And they weren't hippies.
That was the other thing that that fucked me up about it growing up was like yeah, my understanding of hippies was always that they were peaceful and they were just all about peace and love and flowers and nature, and you know what I mean. And that to me all seems great, and then you hear that, hold on a second, a bunch of hippies committed a murder. And that's another thing that in the movie is kind of funny, is like, it kind of shows the girls, walking along singing this song and they're all so happy, and then you contrast to the act of just disgusting violence that they apparently end up committing. And it's like, hold on a second, where does this hippie movement turn into this violent, that's the question, right? It's like, how did that hippie movement turn into these violent massacres? Well, there's an answer there that I don't think we're given in the official story, right? And I
And
think
what does Tarantino show them doing it? No, he doesn't. He says
right.
they didn't do it. Who did it was the society that is represented by these violent movies. We see them watching FBI, and we see them watching Bounty.
Yes.
Oh, I got to get home, or I got to watch FBI. It's on at 8:30 or whatever.
Yeah.
And he's got Rick Dalton wearing the jacket and playing a role as kind of a hippie, and he's saying, look, this murder was not committed by a bunch of hippies in real life. This murder was committed by very deadly elements, a part of the society that are trained on how to actually kill people. That's who did it, not what you think. Not what you think. See, Rick Dalton is like a representative of, I'm not saying his character is this evil character. He's not. He's a likable character, even though he's, he goes out and yells.
He's a mess.
He's a mess, but he's a likable character. He's like, oh man, I screwed that up, right?
He's relatable in a lot of ways, right?
He's very relatable, but it's saying there's something, we're living in a society that reduces you to a dollar sign. In fact, he's going through angst because he's like, I'm all washed up. I'm too old. In fact, the Spawn Ranch, the Spawn movie ranch, where where all the Manson family, one of the ranches that they were living on, it used to be used back in the Jack Cahill Bounty Law days as a movie set before those kinds of TV set, before those kinds of shows kind of went out of favor. So it was kind of like a fading actor. It was kind of like, see, and so, it's just like sheer genius for Tarantino to cast this character, to come up with this, make-believe character, Rick Dalton, who was in all those kinds of movies. And that was his glory days. And now he's going through this crisis.
Wow.
Okay. But he's living in a very commercialized society. You're hearing all these advertisements all the time.
Constantly.
For Tanya or whatever.
Yeah.
It's real. What's amazing about the movie is all the music and even the background music. I'm not even talking about like the Deep Purple music or all the awesome tunes from that era, but also even the background music, like when they're just walking up the driveway and you have this kind of eerie background music. It's like the background music from the 60s.
From those kinds of TV shows.
Like he recreated it. Like the atmosphere is perfect.
It always stuns me the amount that he can fit into a movie. Like there's just so much in there. And that's why you can never just watch it once and think that you've walked away getting the picture, right?
Right. So it's an indictment actually of the society that reduces, I think, or it's not necessarily an indictment, but it's exposing those themes. A great piece of artwork isn't going to be hitting you over the head with, this is the lesson. It's going to be open to lots of interpretation, like Shakespeare. And I would say Tarantino, this is just, this movie is just sheer genius. But let me go back to we'll move along to get to some stars. But what I think he's saying is, this wasn't done by who you think it was done. It is actually an expression of a very violent and commoditizing society that is going around the world doing things like the Vietnam War. That is what is going on.
They commoditize violence.
And so when you see, it's not like, I'm not saying that his Rick Dalton character is a murderer, but it's like he's a representative of Hollywood that is, churning out this kind of basically violent, commoditizing. Wow. You're nothing but a dollar sign. whether you're dead or alive, you're just a
Oh,
dollar sign.
man.
Or Rick Cahill on Bounty Law. And
It's just it's unbelievable that like you can take some of these extremely profound concepts and link them in the ways that he does, and then still manage to have a film that is like that on some level has universal appeal, right? Like just it's just astounding, because like you're making me realize things that I didn't even really think about, and I've thought about the movie more than most people probably have already as it is, right? So it's crazy. It's about America, right? Like they almost in a way had to show people that like violence is cool and violence is something that contributes to the economy. These westerns and these war shows and war movies, it's like, yeah, no, this is how it is. This is society. This is the world. This is how because in reality, they're going around the world doing this stuff. And in fact, their whole society was kind of built upon a lot of these atrocities and stuff. They almost had to normalize it and commoditize it and sell it back to people for it to all work.
and does he explore that in some of his other movies? He talks about the atrocious, heinous crimes that our society wants to forget about, or wants to turn into a fairy tale or gloss over, or
right,
somehow.
just accept that story and just go, yep, let's move past it.
So I think he's so I did teach literature at West Point, and sometimes students will say, oh, come on, is that really in there, or do you think he really meant to do that? And my answer is, I don't really know. I'm not buddies with Quentin Tarantino, and even if you asked him, he might not tell you. But even if he's not doing it consciously, I said in the blog post, I don't know if he did everything in there consciously, or the gods are speaking, or the universe is speaking through. That's what happens.
It's a bit of both, right? Both, right?
The realm of the gods speaks through artists, can speak through everybody. And that's what, let's tie it back to the myths. And, the myths show certain characters who are able to pay attention to when the gods are talking and not fall into disaster.
Wow.
And that's what we want for our life. You want to be you want to be in touch with the whole of who you are. And so you picked up on it already. I mean, great insight, Ezza, on the fact that in the movie, so let's tie it back to what I was talking about with the myths. Jack Cahill not Jack Cahill, but Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth are a twinned pair, right?
Yes.
They're a twinned pair. So, in fact, let me get to the slide that I wanted. I threw in some myths here. How come I didn't? Okay, let me just jump to, this is what I wanted to show here. We've got, you've got this scene pretty close to the beginning where this is Alan Kincaid. Now, if you think you're seeing double, don't adjust your television sets, because, well, in a way, you are. That's what he says.
Wow.
We're seeing double. Now look at the two characters here. Look at what Tarantino's got. Look at what Tarantino
just in that frame.
Inspired direction. Now, if I were to tell you that in the myths, we usually have a twinned pair. One is usually divine and one is usually mortal.
Yes.
Like in Castor and Pollux. Castor is mortal. His brother Pollux, or Polydeuces, is the divine twin. Heracles is the divine twin. Iphicles, his brother, is the mortal twin. Okay. The mortal twin is doubting. In most of these cases, we have a doubting twin. Now, which of these do you think would be the doubting self, and which would be the higher self? I mean, it's just obvious, right?
Yes, of course.
Look at the body language.
Just without even knowing the movie, you can just look at that frame and see which one is the doubtful human and which one is the divine,
and is Rick Dalton
self.
Doubting in the movie?
Of course.
He's full of doubt. He's
constantly.
He's throwing this fit in his trailer at one point, because he's like, Why can't you get it right?
He's got so many good lines, and I think that's why he's so relatable, is because we all have Rick Dalton living in us, man.
That's exactly right. 'Cause we've got an egoic mind, and the myths tell us that. Here's another, look at him. As soon as you, has Brad Pitt changed?
Nope.
Now he's like, oh, there's something on my shirt. I have to flick it off. He's like constantly doubting himself. He's like checking. He's like, man, look at this. Oh, that's not good. Look at him.
How am I looking on camera right now? Yeah.
Exactly. And then look back over to the other half of the twinned pair. But the dialogue in the movie tells you we're talking about a twinned pair. He says, if you think you're seeing double, don't adjust your TV set because, well, you are. You're seeing twins. This is twins. So now let's go to...
And he's his stunt double. he's the guy who does things that the other one's not sure of himself if he can do it or not. So the stunt double, quite literally, is that self that that takes over when fear, when fear would get in the way.
Yeah, great interpretation, great analysis right there, Ezza. So this movie is operating on some pretty cool multiple levels, right? So
wild stuff.
But I think it's showing also that our whole society is dysfunctional and traumatized, because we just showed that Rick Dalton in some ways is like taking on the garment that Manson wears, and Tarantino saying, look, this murder wasn't done by these marginal characters. This murder, this operation, this military style operation was actually done by society. Or I'm not saying society. I think society is good. I think the people in society are good. This is element. This is an element that is doing stuff that is completely not under the control of democratic governance. Is what we want. We want to have a military, but we want it to be under the control of democracy. We want to have security forces and police forces, but we don't want them to be totally unaccountable and they can just roll around and do whatever they want.
Absolutely.
When I was in the Army, I went to West Point. I was an infantry officer. I got to jump out of airplanes. I got to drive around and shoot things with machine guns. I got to fire off, big 25 millimeter, cannons that can just, but it wasn't just for my own. I couldn't just drive around with a machine gun and shoot up whatever the heck I wanted. I could only do that in support of the Constitution, which says that, the people vote for the representatives. And, it was very clear I had that authority to use those weapons for one purpose, to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, not just for my own, whatever I felt like doing. Right. So if you've got security forces that are actually doing operations that result in people being killed in society, that we've got something going wrong. Okay. So I went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but what I'm saying is he's clearly got a twinned character. Rick Dalton is clearly the doubting mind and the imperturbable, kind of just up to any situation higher self is obviously the Cliff Booth character, right? But he's saying, it's also a dysfunctional society. Our society needs to find its true self, get back to its true self.
Well, and I love that you point out that the characters who, like, again, you hear that there's going to be a movie about the Manson murders. You're thinking the Manson family will be the main characters. And it's interesting you point out that they're, in the movie, quite literally marginalized characters. And it makes you think, hold on a second, maybe they're just marginalized characters in the actual story as well. And then that makes you think, well, who is the main characters of the movie? And you have this sort of doubtful self that is created by this sort of element of society. And then you have the underlying essential self that is sort of like, he doesn't really matter almost, you know what I mean? It's like whether he's not he doesn't actually have, it's almost like the society's forgotten about the Cliff Booth. They don't want the Cliff Booth. They're not interested in the Cliff Booth. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
like
well,
he almost,
you're right. That's a good point, like how people relate to him. And I guess he's got a dark past in the movie, right?
that's true. Yeah.
Or an alleged dark past. So, but,
Yeah.
if at one point, actually, Rick Dalton fires him.
Right.
He says, I can't afford you anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, this is but does he go away? No. See, the egoic mind wants to keep, we all have a higher self, but the egoic mind wants to keep it under wraps.
Yes.
I can show you this from myths. I'm just showing it to you from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but you can't get rid of who you really are, your essential self. The egoic mind doesn't want to admit the essential self. It's like doubting Thomas when he's told by the other disciples, hey, the divine twin is back.
Right. Right.
What does Thomas say? Oh, I don't believe it. I don't want to hear about that.
Right.
He wants to deny it. Okay.
Right.
It's like Golem. The Golem mind wants to take hold of the steering wheel and say, I'm in control.
Yeah, because what am I for if this essential self exists, then you don't need me anymore, right?
Defense mechanism. It's a defense
exactly.
mechanism.
Exactly.
Doubt is a defense mechanism, right? If somebody says, hey, something that you think might be too good to be true just happened, and you go, well, hold on now, don't get carried away. Let me look into this. It's because you've been burned and you don't want to get burned again. It's like, well, let me not just go jump.
Exactly.
Your doubting mind developed to help you. We need our doubting mind, but we need it to be in the right relationship. So now I'll go back to the myths. We've gone for a while, so I'll speed through a few myths.
Sweet.
To
I love how it ended up segueing back around into that naturally, regardless, because as I said, a lot of this stuff does come into modern storytelling, as we now see with your Rick Daltons and Cliff Booths. But let's see some of these myths.
Because it's inside of us, I think, because this is,
I could not agree more.
About us.
Yeah.
It's coming through because this is there. It's in there and it's got to come out. And so this is actually a picture from the Bhagavad-Gita. Mm-hmm. And it shows Arjun on the far left as you're looking at the screen, talking with Krishna. And Krishna is the divine charioteer. And this is right at the beginning of this tremendous battle. They're about to go into battle. And Arjun is suddenly at the very eve of the battle, he goes, or right when it's about to kick off and everyone's blowing their conch shells and the armies are all arrayed on the battlefield. He says, I'm filled with doubt. I don't think I want to do this. Now, he is the most powerful warrior on the battlefield. He's actually been up to the heavens to get the weapons of heaven. He's been given special weapons from the gods that are irresistible. He is beyond doubt capable of fighting this battle, but he is filled with doubt.
Wow.
And Arjun has accepted the offer of the divine Lord Krishna to be his charioteer, but he will be his non-combatant charioteer. Krishna actually is a god. He loves all people, even both sides, even though the other side is actually filled with, the other side is led by these kind of villains. But Krishna says, look, because I'm a god, I can only be on one side or the other, and I'll let you guys choose. One of you can have me on your side, but I'll be a non-combatant. I won't actually, kill anybody. I'll just be a charioteer. On the other side, I'll give 100,000 of my irresistible heavenly warriors. And Arjun, who do you want? And Arjun says, well, I'll take you, Krishna. I want you to be on my side, even if you're a non-combatant. And the leader of the other side, kind of smirks and twirls his mustache. Yes. What an idiot. I get the warriors. Okay. So Krishna, I would argue, is the higher self. Or if not, I'm not saying that everyone's higher self is a god, but I will say that how you get in touch with the realm of the gods is through your higher self.
Yes.
how does Tarantino get his inspiration? If he gets inspiration from the higher self, or an artist, any artist, it's because he's in touch with his higher self. That's how you get in touch with, that's how you hear the messages from the divine realm. Is the more you're in touch with your higher self, the more you can be open to these kinds of connections. So Krishna is the higher self. He's driving Arjun around, and Arjun is filled with doubt. Now, what does Cliff Booth do throughout the movie?
Drives him
He
around.
drives Dalton around, right?
Wow.
But Arjun in this case is filled with doubt. He says, I'm just going to get out of the chariot here and sit down in the dust. And I don't care if, somebody kills me. I can't go into this battle. And Krishna then begins to give him the song of the Lord, which in Sanskrit is the Bhagavad-Gita. The song of the Lord is the Bhagavad-Gita. It's part of this larger epic.
Right.
But it's not about something that happened thousands of years ago. This is about us in the battlefield of this life, filled with doubts, and you got to get in touch with your higher self.
Wow.
And they actually say this in other ancient texts, Sanskrit texts, and the Puranas, and the different, there's thousands of texts, but there's actually people who, there's writings that interpret this as, you have to be like, the higher self is the one that controls the chariot. You've got the mind and the senses. The senses are the horses, the emotions that are pulling the chariot, and they can get out of control. They can run away with you, just like, your emotions can run away with you, or your senses when you see, something you really want. It can like overwhelm you. But the mind is like the reins. The mind is the reins that controls the senses and controls the horses. And if the reins are in the hands of a good charioteer, then the chariot will be okay. But if they're, in the hands of a distracted charioteer, you're going to go off the cliff. Well, it's very interesting that the mind is the reins, because you would think, wait a minute, isn't the mind the one who's holding the reins? Who's holding the reins? Well, it could either be your higher self, as in this is the correct. We want to give, there's actually something behind your mind. Your mind is kind of like the egoic mind. We want to give the reins over to the higher self. That's who we want to be steering our life. You want to get in touch with your higher self. So this is, this isn't just my interpretation. I'm saying the ancient writings of the ancient Indian culture tells you that this is a metaphor for what we're going through. And now I'm going to show you that this is actually also based on the stars. I've written about this, but you see there up at the very top, also a special thing that happens in this chariot. There's a banner or a standard at the top that has a god Hanuman on the top of the chariot. Hanuman is a god, and actually he like shouts from the banner. It's like a magical banner that has, so he also assists in the battle for Arjun. But see, Arjun is full of doubt, but in this case, he has to talk with Krishna, and Krishna in the Bhagavad-Gita tells him over and over, here's how you should live. Here's what you need to do. You need to get rid of the doubting mind by doing what's right act as if you're not acting. It's like the art of action without action that Bruce Lee actually talks about. I know he's in the movie. He was actually a very awesome fighter. So that's another fairy tale part of it. But not to get distracted. The art of acting without acting. Krishna says you should actually act as if you're not acting. Because if you act without doubt, it's almost as if you're not acting. But you have to do what's right without concern from the outcome. Then that's the whole message of the Bhagavad-Gita over and over.
Wow.
And so here's a picture. So we don't have too much time to go into all the constellations because
there's lots of them out there, aren't there?
Yeah, there's lots. But this is the region of the sky. I talked about it a little bit on Sam's show too. But this is the region of the sky that I'm convinced matches up with this part of the Bhagavad-Gita and the Mahabharata that the Bhagavad-Gita is part of. So Sagittarius down there in the lower left, you see Sagittarius down there at the lower left? Sagittarius is a archer. You can see the large outline of the bow.
Yep.
Arjun is one of these 5 hero brothers that are called the Pandavas, and his weapon is the bow, and he's associated with Sagittarius. And you can see, look at the bow, look at how his hands are folded. Actually, Sagittarius, the bow is sometimes interpreted as folded hands in some myths.
Yeah.
So that is a Sagittarius figure next to Ophiuchus. Now look at the cart that they're in, the war car that they ride into battle. It has like almost an umbrella kind of a top.
Yep.
A canopy on the top. That's Ophiuchus actually plays a role sometimes of a chariot. You can even see this in Greek myths of the Iliad, some Greek artwork where Achilles is driving a chariot, dragging Hector, and it's clearly in the same outline as these constellations. I'm not going to get into that right now, but it's interesting that Brad Pitt also plays Achilles in the Iliad. But in Achilles is a higher self type figure.
Oh, wow.
But, so Ophiuchus matches up with the war car, and the real one of the clinchers. There's lots of evidence that I can point to match up with this. Now, if people haven't seen this before, they're probably like, hey, this seems like a stretch. But look at the top. Above Ophiuchus is the constellation Hercules. Let me see if I can move this up here. Oops. Constellation Hercules is above Ophiuchus. Can you see the constellation Hercules?
Yep.
Very distinctive outline of that constellation. Deep knee bend, one leg forward, one arm reaching forward, kind of a square-shaped head, and raising a huge kind of club or sword overhead, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm going to show you a picture of, okay, well, I didn't lead up to that very well. First, I'm going to show you that Krishna is associated with Ophiuchus. So this is a picture. So I'll show you that Hanuman is associated with Hercules. First, I'll show you that Krishna is, I forgot my own script.
No problem.
Like Rick Dalton. Line. This is Krishna in a different story. This is another very famous story where Krishna defeats this 100-headed or 101-headed cobra, actually a being of cobras called the Nagas. They're almost like god snakes that live in the water, and they're not necessarily always evil. They're just very powerful, and sometimes they get selfish, as in this case, Krishna had to subdue this Nag named the Kaliya Nag. His name is Kaliya. He lives in this water. He wouldn't let anyone go past the water. Even birds that flew over the water would drop dead because the Nag in the water was so powerful and poisonous. He would be emanating this poison all the time, so the birds would even fall down into the river when they went over. And Krishna said, this is just too much. I'm going to put a stop to that. So he goes and jumps into the river and starts playing around. And the Nag, Kaliya, comes up and says, what's going on? Who's playing in my river? You're not allowed to be here. And Krishna begins to play his flute and dance on the heads of the Nag. And Kaliya soon realizes, this is not, I thought this was just a human, this is a god. And Krishna starts to assume the entire weight of the universe. And you can see the blood dripping out of Kaliya's, the heads. And his wives, Kaliya's wives come up and plead with Krishna, please don't kill him, he'll be good. And so this is actually reenacted every year in some of the rivers. They have, a young man play the role of Krishna and dance on the head of they have these big cobra statues or floats that they put in the river. Anyway, let me reverse it, because sometimes the artwork, the artist is matching it up with the stars, but they do it in reverse. But this is Krishna playing a flute, holding a conch shell. You can see the conch shell there on the right, dancing on a multi-headed serpent. Now take a look at, I would argue that Krishna lines up mostly with the constellation Ophiuchus.
Yep.
See how he's standing on top of Scorpio?
Yep, and Scorpio's got the multi-headed,
plays a multi-headed snake
serpent,
in lots of different myths, like the Hydra that Heracles has to fight.
Wow.
He even has a flute on the side. On one side, if you look on the left, there's a flute Those are the two serpent halves of Ophiuchus. I won't get too into it, but the conch shell and the flute can actually be seen in the heavens. So Krishna definitely lines up with Ophiuchus. And in fact, Ophiuchus, I gotta move this thing out of the way. Whoops. Ophiuchus has that kind of canopy over the head, over the top. See the little umbrella at the top of Krishna
Yes.
there?
Yes.
And the flute. So those are symbols that would line up with an Ophiuchus, a character's lined up with Ophiuchus. But now I'll tell you that Hanuman is also associated with, so if that's not enough proof for you, Hanuman is associated with the constellation Hercules, and Hercules is above Ophiuchus. Here's another picture of Hanuman. There's a terracotta statue of Hanuman. Notice what his chosen weapon is. It's a big mace.
Yes.
Okay. Hercules figures usually have a very huge club or sword, or sometimes it's a hammer. Sometimes it's an axe. There's a god, a thunder god of Africa, who named Shango, who has an axe, or Shango has a powerful axe, and he's a thunder god, and he's associated with the same constellation, Hercules. Look at the outline of Hercules.
Wow.
Look at the outline of Hanuman.
And if I'm not mistaken, Hanuman is kind of like a half monkey, half god, which is almost like what we are, like, and Hercules is a demigod, and Thor would be one of those kind of demigod characters. So that Hercules, apparently Hanuman, it's almost the same character, and the same attributes are given to that character. It's wild.
That's right. Look at the square-shaped head of Hercules. So that's a distinctive aspect of the constellation Hercules, is a square-shaped head, which in most myths so all the constellations can play either a male character or a female character. Sagittarius often plays a female character, often plays a male character. Hercules more often seems to play a male character, but also plays a female character. But the square-shaped head, usually it's a male character with a full beard. Thor usually has a full beard. Zeus usually has a full beard. Hercules, the hero, usually has a full beard. And Hanuman actually has this kind of rough, like a monkey.
Like a monkey would, yeah.
A square-shaped head. So, and one other thing, you see what Hanuman's holding up in his hand? His other hand, he's holding up a triangular, it's actually the mountains. He brings back a whole mountain from the Himalayas.
Okay.
He's reaching down towards Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus sometimes plays a mountain. So,
okay.
So what I'm saying is that we can see for sure that Krishna, in the story of the Bhagavad-Gita, where Arjun is filled with doubt, is associated with Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus has above it Hercules, just like in the Bhagavad-Gita, the war car of Krishna and Arjun has Hanuman at the top of it. So anyway, that the myths are teaching us, these stories are actually showing us how to get back in touch with our higher self. That's what they're doing. That's what they're about. That's one of their messages. And they're all based on the stars, which shows that they're not literal any more than the events of, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Don't get angry if it doesn't, because it's not literal.
Yes.
It's trying to teach you something. The same thing with the myths. They're not literal. We can show that they're in the stars. So what are they about? They're actually about us. Anyway, so that's
wow. And
that's
I think
what's going on there.
That's the essential takeaway from all this, really, is right from what we said at the beginning, these myths, are us, and they and it's become more clear to me after this conversation that they provide the language with which to speak about this stuff. Even, I mean, now we're kind of like coming up with psychology and stuff is sort of coming up with terms for these different aspects of the self. But until really now, with some of these, as you say, cutting edge researchers that are coming up with some of these psychological terms for this stuff, the myths had it all. And there's really no other language to point to that other than what we've always had.
That's right. And actually, Sigmund Freud, when he was trying to express all these different psychological relationships, went to the myths. He used the myths to explain these things. And he was talking about disconnection from the self too. But anyway, you're absolutely right. The myths were given to us to help us with these things that we're wrestling with, that we go to psychologists about, that to try and help us with things that we need to like get on with our life, to live our life.
Yes.
The myths are right there. They're this tremendous resource. The stories in the Bible, exact same, tremendous resource. Telling stories about how to get back in touch with your higher self. There's twins all over the place in the Bible too. There's twins in the Old Testament. There's twins in the New Testament. So they are there as a resource. And I think we can hear their message much better if we listen to them in the language that they're actually speaking. I always say this, but it's true. If someone comes to you and starts telling you something, if you can like learn the language that they're trying to tell you the lesson in, you might be able to understand it better.
Yeah, and there won't be any tragic misinterpretations, right? Which we've seen time and time again. And just one final point is that I think that is another thing that makes this so mind-blowing to me, is that it really shows that the struggles that we face today, just in our intimate personal lives, have always been faced by humans. And it's always been based on that same disconnection. So it's it's almost reassuring that like the problems that you go through are universal, and that the solution is accessible, and it has always been, and it will always be. And I think that your research really points to that. So thank you so much, David, and thank you for coming on.
Hey, that was a great insight. I really appreciate it, Ezra, but that's exactly right. As Gandalf says, that's a very hopeful thing. When you see that it's already in the most ancient myths of Gilgamesh, the most ancient myths of ancient Egypt. It's not just a problem that you're the first one to ever have to fix it.
Yes.
It's a very hopeful thing, because it's actually part of our human condition. We all have to wrestle with it. If our society, we can make our society less traumatizing, then maybe people might be able to live from self much more. It'd be much more common for us to be in touch with our higher self or listening to our essential self and having that guide us. But it is a very hopeful thing that we've got the myths there. So I really appreciate you having me on. I enjoyed talking with you. I thought you really picked up on really some awesome insights as we were going through. So I think you really made the conversation, it takes two people to draw out there's another myth where all the gods have to get together and spit into a kettle, and then wisdom comes out of it.
That's awesome.
It comes out from everybody interacting.
And that's partly why podcasting is so important and essential right now as well. So thank you for recognizing that and the kind words. And hey, we'll have you on again sometime. And like you say, it's a very hopeful thing. One day we'll be there, man. One day we'll be there.
Hey, thanks a lot, Eric, and happy birthday to you.
Thank you so much, brother. I really appreciate you, and have a great rest of your weekend.
You too, man.
Thanks.
Bye.
About to take a plane to another plane, to another plane, to another plane, bumping Bacca not nice while I'm trapping in the rain.